So I'm reading this morning, as I've already hinted, Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. Start with a typo, that's good, isn't it? There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us." And he said, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment." But Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "They do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead." So 2.5 years ago, when those first COVID lockdowns came into force, we were just discovering that we could do something in the way of church using Zoom. I remember some discussion about what time we would hold our Thursday evening meetings. We decided to make it 7 o'clock rather than 7:30, because for those first couple of months, there was that brief tradition had kicked off of going out in front of your house and clapping for the NHS on Thursday evenings at 8 o'clock. I got a few slightly frowny looks from Jenny at that time, I thought, because my reckoning was that if you're going to make a noise for the NHS, you might as well set a town on it. So Jenny clapped. I found I could make rather more noise by looking for one of the biggest saucepans in the house and the biggest spoon to wallop it with. I don't know what the problem with that would be. Maybe it's just a boy kind of thing. Anyway, something that startled me about those days, when the kids locked down everywhere around the country, started doing their "Thank you NHS" posters and this kind of stuff, and then sticking them in their windows. Just about all of them, if you notice, had a rainbow in some form or other. Maybe just rainbow letters, but rainbows featured very highly. The odd thing, though, was that some naive gay activists actually complained that the NHS or the country was stealing their symbol of the rainbow. Whereas, of course, many Christians have found that the use of the rainbow to support all things pride is quite offensive in itself. And we might even say they are the ones who have misappropriated someone else's symbol in the first place. Now, when you look at those kids' pictures of rainbows, what you typically see is a set of concentric semicircles of different color paints or crayons or whatever. Traditionally, there are how many colors in the rainbow? 7. And there they are. Although I confess I could never really make an awful lot of distinction between indigo and violet. Still, when you look at a real rainbow, of course, there are not 6 or 7 distinct shades. There's a gentle gradation of colors that we perceive as shades of red, all the way through to eventually the different shades of violet. We see exactly the same kind of thing if we try to split up light in a lab with a prism. Different wavelengths of light are refracted to different extents. And so the entering beam of white light emerges as a continuous spectrum of, in principle, every color we could ever see or distinguish. And so nowadays we use the word spectrum in a non-literal sense to mean something that encompasses a wide variety of people or opinions, for example. Maybe even to encompass the whole of society. Everyone's on that spectrum somewhere. So we'd say that people on the opposite ends of the spectrum are as different as we could imagine them being. And in fact, that's precisely what we have in that parable we're looking at today that I just read to you a moment ago. In just a few sentences, Jesus sketches for us two people who are so totally different on two opposite ends of the spectrum. But I think we have to recognize them as caricatures, exaggerations for effect, for that storytelling effect. Some Christians will insist that this is a story taken from real life. I remember someone stating many years ago, very emphatically in relation to this parable, that the Lord Jesus Christ never told a word of a lie. And of course, he's right. I agree with that sentiment, but this isn't about a lie. This is about a parable. It's a story which Jesus put together for effect. They don't have to be actual living, or in this case, dying people when it's a parable. Jesus is doing, yet again, some imaginative storytelling. So this means that we don't need to insist that these are two actual human beings whose lives just intersected at the rich man's gate. I don't think that we need to take how Jesus develops the parable as giving us definitive information about what happens after death either. It's all crafted to make a wallop of a point, or what you sometimes call a sting in the tail. In fact, I've even seen this twisted as well. There's a book came out many years ago called A Sting in the Tail, T-A-L-E, about the parables that Jesus told. We'll get back to that. But we need to go, first of all, to the beginning of the parable and actually a bit further back in Luke's gospel to see just what is going on here and what this parable is actually about. Because I think Luke gives us context to help us to understand that, as Jesus starts to weave another of those wonderful mental images for us. But not just for us, for people back then as well. So, Luke records how things start here. Jesus speaking, there was a rich man. If we read from the beginning of the chapter, though, we find how this fits into this chapter. Wealth has already greatly featured in Luke chapter 16. Just at the start of the chapter, Jesus also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager. Charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. We haven't got time to go into that parable now as well. But Jesus' conclusion to this, another made-up story, focuses in very tightly on wealth and attitudes towards it. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? So there's unrighteous wealth in the context there. That's money and possessions and influence and stuff like that in this world. And there's true riches, which are something different, relating to a different kingdom, a different existence. How we interact with the one, the unrighteous wealth of this world, will have profound consequences on whether we are ever given the true riches. In fact, it's a mutually exclusive relationship, says Jesus. The next verse, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. But he had some hearers there who were none too impressed with this conclusion. Verse 40, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things and they ridiculed him. And it's going to be those leaders of the Jewish people, including Pharisees who were lovers of money, who in a few months' time will be trying to suppress the popularity of Jesus And in particular, when it comes to the proclamation that Jesus rose from the dead. Spoiler alert here, that's where Jesus is heading to at the end of this parable. Resurrection from the dead. Pharisees' likely response to it. Spoiler alert, he said to him, last verse of the chapter, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. So we know that's where it's going. And because it starts with all this stuff about wealth and Pharisees who were lovers of wealth, that I think needs to dictate how we understand the parable and what we think it's focusing on. But, okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the start of the parable and relish the simple but incredibly effective storytelling before that big punch lands. So here's character number one, very much from one end of the spectrum. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. Now, Jesus is definitely laying this on very thick here. Many were just so familiar with the story that we miss the details. But obviously we know that this man is rich. But there's rich, and then there's rich. So here's one further detail for us to know. If this guy's at one end of the spectrum, the color we're talking about is imperial purple. Clothed in purple. The color that, because it came from a very rare, expensive dye, only the super rich could afford. This guy is not just rich, says Jesus, he's super rich. Nowadays, this is not the kind of person who has a boat moored at Milo. He has this kind of super yacht. That's the league we're talking about here. And with all that purple will go all the trimmings you expect. There's fine linen, or nowadays we'd say top range designer clothing. And maybe there's even more. The word that Matthew uses here, which we've got translated feasted, well, it's certainly right that this guy did more than just eat well each day. Saying feasted boosts that to a higher level, or at least a higher quality. But notice, if you still use the authorized version, how that was translated there. Not just feasted, but fared sumptuously. And that includes food. I think Matthew's original word there could extend more broadly than just food. So the guy fared sumptuously in every aspect of his life. I wonder if that's the hint that we're getting here. There was no stinting in anything. The word means literally to put in a good frame of mind. At the risk of using a rather tame word now, he was all round happy. Life could not be better for him. He has reached the pinnacle. He is totally at one end of the spectrum. Now Jesus introduces us with amazing economy of words to someone at totally the other end of the spectrum. We don't even need to travel very far either. And at this rich man's gate, a poor man. But just as the rich man is super rich, the poor man is super poor. He's not just short of cash, by the looks of it, but short of health too. Verse 20 includes the word, at his gate was laid a poor man. It looks as if he can't get there by himself. So he has to be brought and laid there. We don't know any details. And of course, this is just a parable. You don't get details. Fill in the details for yourself with something appropriate. Your imagination can fill in the blanks. But here's something further to extend this picture of pitiable poverty even further. He's not just lame to whatever extent, from whatever cause you have invented. He's hideously ill as well, covered with sores. First Bible I ever bought for myself was illustrated. I'm just glad it didn't illustrate this particular point. But we've still not reached the furthest end of the spectrum. As well as poor and ill in various ways, this man is achingly hungry, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. But this poor man doesn't get any food. Instead, he gets to be food. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. Probably don't think they're of cute little pooches nowadays. Don't even think of back in Jesus's time, the semi-domesticated dogs that would be maybe in a household. This is more likely the feral dogs from the streets. I guess they don't try and take a chunk out of the poor man's body because there's scarcely any flesh on the bones worth nipping off. But there are at least those succulently saline open wounds that could be licked. With that moreover word there, Jesus emphasizes we really have come up against the buffers at the other end now. This is the complete opposite of end of the spectrum in setting up the parable. You couldn't think of a happier person and a sadder person than the two he has described here. But where is he planning to take them as the story progresses? Actually, before we move on, what have I missed out in setting the scene here? What did I not mention? Did you notice that only one of these two men is given a name? Mentioned that earlier on when talking about that hymn. I don't think that can be an incidental point. We talk about people making a name for themselves. There's the Hollywood famous star-studded pavement, the Walk of Fame. Just this last week, there was another star added to that pavement, Luciano Pavarotti, admittedly posthumously, so how much it actually profits him, I don't know. But we would say when someone's name appears on that pavement, they have arrived. They have made a name for themselves. So why is it that in Jesus' story, the poor man has a name, but the rich man doesn't? Why does Jesus grant him only the unnamed grave that is usually reserved for paupers? I think it could be that Jesus is flagging up. He's going to turn the whole apple cart upside down in just a few more words. But I wonder if the actual name he chooses isn't significant too. Yeah, he could have, Fred, the equivalents of Fred or Bert or Tom or, all of those. But he chooses Lazarus. Let's put it up on the screen for you. At his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus. Of course, we did mention there's an even more famous Lazarus in the Gospels, the man Jesus raised from the dead. The significance of the name would work there too. Does anyone know the meaning of the word of the name Lazarus? Lots of chocolate to be earned here, folks. Right, there's the name Lazarus. It's Matthew would have written it in Greek. It's slightly Latinized for us in our English Bibles now. That is a Greek version of a Hebrew name, which I must admit, the first time I heard this, I said, what? That is the Greek version of the Hebrew name Eliezer. You might think it sounds nothing like, but look at the consonants there. Vowels change easily between languages, but you've got the L, the Z, and the R. It's the same name, but just in a different language. So does anyone know what Eliezer means? Hebrews very often sort of chucks two words together, so let's split them down the middle. E-L, anyone? Name for God. Possibly with the I at the end there, my God. Ezer. Anyone remember that story of why there was a Christian name that Dickens used, Ebenezer? Do you remember what that was meant to translate? The story of the stone Eben of help. So those are the two Hebrew words, God and help. And you might think, when it comes to looking at Lazarus laid at the rich man's gate, with all of that going on, God help him. Now, that is a strange name to give, because that significance wouldn't have been lost on Jesus. The man whom God helps And in fact, the other Lazarus, the man whom God helps, you mean the one that Jesus deliberately didn't go to help and let die before raising him from the dead? What help was God to these people? I think we do need to pick up this point as we go through. Don't expect to be able to correctly judge God's help by human standards. In Jesus's parable, it looks at first as if God has greatly helped that rich man. But the object of God's help is at exactly the opposite end of the spectrum. So if you become ill, God has not let you down. If you lose your job, if you can't afford a holiday, it isn't because God is maybe getting you for something you did in the past, even if your conscience falsely tempts you to think that way. No, God is the God who flips the spectrum over. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent empty away. And a good Anglican will say or sing that every Sunday morning. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. And despite how it looks, here at the front end of Jesus' parable, that reversal of human thinking is what we need. What you see of Lazarus, hungry and wretched, we are told to mentally revise. Remember Paul writing to Corinth, chapter 4, his second letter. So we do not lose heart. We might have things that would cause people to lose heart, people whose minds are set on just this world only. But there is another world, just as in Jesus's parable, where things will be different. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. Folks, we've had somebody who's got a birthday today. An extra year is a delight when you're 7. It isn't always quite such a delight to notch up another round of the lap when you're in double digits. The outer self does start to waste away. Do you believe what it says here about inward renewal? For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. The things that are seen are transient. The things that are unseen are eternal. Indeed, we're going to get a glimpse of some unseen things now, at least in picture language, warning you again, don't take this too literally, this parable. So, even though Lazarus and the unnamed rich man are now totally opposite in life and then leveled in death, the poor man died, the rich man also died. Humanly speaking, that's the end of the story, but it's not the end of Jesus's story here. Jesus lifts that veil and looks beyond. Even from that moment of death, there is still a difference, but it's a total reversal. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. Actually, would for that rich man that burial was the end of it. Now the picture's become even less comfortable to modern ears, at least. You notice here how nowadays in this world there is so much focus, and you might say rightly, on alleviating hardships before death. But this world is not fussed at all about avoiding horrors after death. Folks, notice what Jesus says here. Despite what you might hear at funeral services from some people claiming to speak on his behalf, there are 2 destinations. The curtain is drawn up on Act 2 of Jesus's parable, when the spectrum now appears to be drawn the other way around. The poor man died, was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. The rich man is no longer rich. Jesus doesn't mention that. Maybe it's no longer relevant. But he's certainly no longer feasting sumptuously. In fact, just a drop of water would be a wonder. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame." Now, there's two things that I find really quite curious here. First of all, do you notice how Lazarus fades from the picture, fades from this story as a character? He was almost there. He could almost have been a cardboard cutout to start with. He's even more distant now. He doesn't do anything. We might want to know, but what's it like for Lazarus at Abraham's side? We don't hear a dicky bird about it. But that's not what the parable is about. We should have seen that coming with the context Luke gave us. This is Jesus's comment and warning towards those Pharisees seeking to serve two masters and destined to fail. But secondly, as Jesus's camera now clearly pivots more and more towards the unnamed, formerly rich man, I'm quite surprised at what doesn't happen here. I took this picture the other day at Cambrai Leisure Centre. And I suddenly registered a profoundly sexist thought. Does anyone trace my thinking? Yeah. Why are there no male changing rooms? And the sexist thought as well, men don't change, do they? Actually, men not changing is what we see in Jesus's parable. The rich man thinks he still has retained some authority over Lazarus. Even now, in the picture language of this parable, he thinks that Lazarus is still a minion to be sent running to his aid. As I've been thinking about it this week, I'm seeing this parable rather less and less as teaching about the afterlife, but rather more and more as teaching and warning about how we can harden ourselves in this life, so that eventually the barrier between those two destinations that Jesus introduces into this parable, that barrier becomes totally unbridgeable. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. Folks, remember the context here. Pharisees, and anyone else for that matter, trying to serve two masters, God and money. The rich man chooses to ignore Lazarus during his lifetime. It's as if, flipping the image upside down here, he is building a wall between them. To start with, there's no wall. In the early stages, he could have easily reached over that wall if he chose to, but he doesn't. Each time he walks past the beggar at his gate, he builds another course of bricks along that wall, or he thickens the plaster. With effort, later, he could knock it down. A bit later along, he'd need their equivalent of a JCB. But eventually that wall becomes just part of the scenery that he walks by, thinking less and less of the poor man on the other side, safely out of sight and out of mind. Until that inevitable day when life finishes and the next begins. And no, I'm not talking reincarnation. The Bible doesn't think in those terms. It says this: it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. Only Jesus does not take us to the courtroom now. He takes us beyond that. He shows us the division between two places, those two destinations. After the judgment, we are whisked straight past that scene and simply shown the consequences. Curiously, the wall that the rich man had been building up through his lifetime is now perpetuated here in eternity, with one difference. Now it cannot be dismantled. It is fixed and it is permanent. Lazarus, the man whom God has now most definitively helped, is at Abraham's side. It's designed for Jewish audience, remember? The roles have been reversed. The spectrum is upside down. It's just like when you see a double rainbow. Have you ever noticed this? The more typical one is the lower one there. And you see, look carefully, red at the top. The second rainbow further up spectrum is the other way up. That's what's happened in this parable. It's flipped over. The rich man is elsewhere, he's still unnamed, but in a condition which is dreadfully specified, in Hades, being in torment, in anguish in this flame. Now, I wouldn't care to state there that flames are an accurate scientific description of what will be found in that terrible place. I think that's probably taking the story element of this parable too far. But I think it's clear enough that Jesus's description makes it clear that Hades or hell, or whatever name we choose to give it, that place, that state of lostness, is awful beyond our comprehension. It is to be avoided at any cost whatsoever. And yet, it's not that people are confined there by God's predestination or his judgment, or not alone. People are confined there by the wall that we have also willingly built for ourselves, knowingly built for ourselves during our lives. We will only receive the consequences of our own choices. There is nobody else to blame. And yet Jesus introduces a quirk here. Although the formerly rich man is now irrevocably lost, he has possibly the first ever charitable thought in his whole life. What about his family back at home? He said, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house. I've got 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment." See, he still cannot learn or change. He still thinks, send Lazarus. He's still a minion, errand boy. It's not that Lazarus has no work to do at Abraham's side. It's just that Abraham will not send him on a futile mission. For one thing, those brothers have already been provided for. And Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. Folks, do you realize that you shouldn't be waiting for God to speak to you, because he already has? That's what the scriptures are. Even clearer now than Moses and the prophets looking forward to Jesus Christ. So folks, do you actually read this stuff where God has spoken? We have Jesus and his apostles. Let us hear them. What's wrong with what God has already put on record? What more do we need? But this rich man knows the hearts of his brothers, because maybe he has some more insight to his own heart now. And he recognizes that he had Moses and the prophets, and it didn't work for him, so why would it work for them? And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." I think so. Spoken before the event, you might. Those smug Pharisees that Jesus is speaking to, who thought they could safely serve God and mammon, would mostly continue to mock. And even when someone does go to them from the dead, Jesus himself, they will still try to suppress that truth. He said to them, they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. If someone rises from the dead, they will just stuff their fingers in their ears even more firmly. Folks, what do you make of the fact that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead? Do you think that what we'll be doing just a few minutes' time at the end of these services is just the right thing to do? It's a religious ritual that we're just obliged to do over and over, saying the right words, but it's ultimately empty. It's a house built on sand, of which more in a couple of weeks' time. Folks, the longer you ignore the call of Jesus Christ, the longer you harden your heart, the more like that spiritually poor rich man, building walls around ourselves, which will ultimately harden into the bars of a prison of eternal death. The more like that we will become if we continue to ignore what Jesus says. So listen up, and listen up now. Here's Jesus's take-home message from this parable. Jesus has risen from the dead. Concerning just what in all of your life is that not going to be the most significant factor? What in all of your life is not going to change? because lo, Jesus meets us, risen from the tomb. Folks, let's pray, shall we?